thank you everyone for coming along. My name's Tony Birch and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Wheeler Centre to tonight's conversation with Jeff Goodell, and we're going to talk about his book, The Water Will Come. Before we start chatting with Jeff specifically, there are a couple of possibly what we might call housekeeping issues, but important issues. The first one is to acknowledge that we're here tonight on the land of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Greater Kulin Nation, and we pay respect to both of those nations and certainly their elders past, present and future. But in saying that, as a gesture of generosity that would be extended to you from elders of both of those communities, I also want to welcome all of you here tonight and certainly pay respect to your families and elders. I want to welcome Jeff here tonight, coming here from the United States. I was very lucky to be on a panel with Jeff in Sydney at the Sydney Writers' Festival a couple of weeks back. He's since been to the Auckland Writers' Festival and he's back here with us tonight in Melbourne. So thank you and welcome to Melbourne, Jeff. And we want to be sure that you get a chance to chat to Jeff briefly, since there are so many of you. You can all have an individual conversation with Jeff. If you buy a copy of Jeff's book, our bookseller Dimmicks are down the back there, so we thank you to Dimmicks, and Jeff will be down at the table later on signing books and having conversations which we may limit to 30 seconds a person. I have been in a situation where people have talked to me for 10 minutes and not bought a book, but there you go. So everyone, welcome here tonight. Just as I suppose a pointer to the local history of this place, which is very relevant to Jeff's book. At one point early in the book, Jeff talks about Hudson's Canyon, which is the extension of the Hudson River. And this canyon, which is deeper than the Grand Canyon, is the old river, the old Hudson River as it was before the end of the Ice Age. And it's a remarkable story about the change of geography and the change of landscape that occurs as a result of change of climate. And the reason I bring it up is that, and for Jeff's benefit, and for some of you here who won't know this, we have a similar story here in Melbourne, or Narma, as is known to Aboriginal people, that the Yarra River, the Birrong River, has its own canyon, not so deep as the Grand Canyon, but we have a bay in Melbourne called Port Phillip Bay, and again, before the end of the Ice Age, there was no Port Phillip Bay. It's a very young waterway in the sense of Indigenous time, and that channel goes out to what we know, as you all know, as Port Phillip Heads, which was the original mouth of the Birrong River. The other reason I ask it, because it'll lead to the first question I have for Jeff. In 1835, a man called Joseph Tice Gellibrand bought a boat across Bass Strait, and he came out at what we know as Coronella in Western Port. And when he was coming up to the early Port Phillip settlement, he met two Wurundjeri men. And the two Wurundjeri men told him the story of the Birrong, told him the story that generations ago there was no bay and that the river ended in another place. And what Gellibrand did, he wrote that story down. It was reproduced in his diaries, but he reproduced it as what he called an affectionate folk tale. In 2005, when the Port of Melbourne Authority wanted to dredge the shipping lane in Port Phillip Bay from what it was then 14 metres down to 17 metres, they sent two archaeological divers down to investigate the depth of a crevice at the bottom of the shipping lane, which they thought was several metres deep. Those two archaeological divers went down and they went down, they went down, and at the end point, they stood on the original bed of the Birrong River, which was 102 metres below the shipping lane. And then the story was verified not as a quaint folktale, but as scientific fact. So one of the things that I want to ask you at the outset, Jeff, because you talk both about the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities and certainly your journeys going around the globe visiting Indigenous communities as part of that journey, what do you think the impact of past historical claim to changing climate and the relationship between Indigenous people, land and climate, thinking about that, what do you think Indigenous communities have to offer in relationship to how we might think and deal with climate change today?
Wow, that's a very interesting question to start things off with. I just want to say first thank you, and thank you all for coming here. I'm very glad to see such a full house here. So, one of the sort of big discoveries for me with this book happened when I went to Lagos. I went to Lagos to look at some of the water slums there. About 300,000 people live in the lagoon behind the city that live on houses sort of essentially on stilts that are just sort of put up there in the lagoon. And when I talked to the people in that community, what was striking to me was I would talk to them about storm surges and living with water and sea level rise, and they were just like, we don't care if water goes up 3 feet tomorrow, we can raise our houses this afternoon. It's not a problem, it doesn't take us long to deal with this. And they lived in a way that was very flexible with water. They had a kind of adaptability that was very different from the way we live. And it really struck me that the essential problem with sea level rise, which is what this book is about, is that we modern people have built a lot of our infrastructure on the coastlines with the idea that the water is here and the land is here and that will never change. And that's because that's how it was when we were kids, that's how it will be forever, and because we can't witness it changing in any profound way. If we rent a house for 2 weeks at the beach, we think that's how it will always be, and it's not. And one of the things that's happening now in our world is that border between land and sea is changing very fast, and is going to be changing even faster in the future. So I think that what Indigenous communities, they lived in a way that was much more flexible with the coastlines. I visited shell middens in Florida, where it was very adaptable. They could move with the water. They didn't have $10 million hotels, with big swimming pools, or highways or airports on the water. And so we've invested all of this money and all of this stuff that is very badly adapted. Mm-hmm. So what these indigenous cultures showed me was this sort of simpler way of living more in harmony with our changing world. Mm-hmm. And that is something that we, in a broad way, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to go back to.
It's interesting that you mentioned Florida, because you visit Miami and Florida early in the book, and you return to it. One of the themes that comes through the book, and not only for that location but for others, is that you have this history of speculation, land speculation, greed, sort of get rich.
Greed in Florida?
Yeah, get rich ideas. Is that one of the things that seems to still be with us and with us globally, is that you start by looking at some of those sort of grandiose schemes from the 1920s, and they're still being reproduced. So when you just then talk about the idea of Indigenous adaptability, it seems that those who think about architecture in the way of what it will do now, and think about it only in possibly 1 or 2 generations, is that modern society has not learnt and is not learning the lessons of adaptability, and what seems to be stupidity. I wonder if it's almost willful stupidity, because I think what your book shows is people know that these schemes don't have a long shelf life. They don't seem to be concerned that these follies do not have a long shelf life. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those discussions that you had with some of those people and how you perceive their lack of ethics or even interest in those problems that they continue to repeat.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very profound point. I mean, I think that, what I saw in Florida, I spent, the book is sort of built around Florida, and then because that's where I first sort of discovered this problem of sea level rise. And I didn't discover the problem of sea level rise, but I first really profoundly thought about the implications of it, and Florida is the sort of poster child for the kinds of risks and troubles that we're already facing and will continue to face. So that's the sort of star of the book, and then I, go around the world and look at other places kind of in contrast. And, Miami is emblematic in many ways, and it's one of the ways it's emblematic is that it's embodies the American idea of, build what you can as fast as you can and get out of it as much as you can, as quickly as you can. The whole idea there is, Miami is a empire of real estate development, and it was a swamp. And they figured out how to fill in the swamp with just enough mud to kind of, build buildings on top of it. And nobody was thinking about when they dug the trenches and threw the mud up, how high to throw the mud, or how long that mud's going to stay there, or how long the houses they built on top of the mud were going to stay there. It was all about, like, can we sell this to Easterners who want to come down here with their girlfriends and hang out on the beach. And that's that kind of exploitation idea is really what built Miami. And what, at a deep level, a kind of American capitalism is about. And I'm not, we had this discussion in Sydney. I actually believe in capitalism, and I think that capitalism can be changed. But it's the question in Florida, and that this book really brings up, is who is looking out for the long term. Mm-hmm. You talk to developers in Florida, they have a 5-year time horizon, right? That from the time they start the investment in a place until they're out of it, it's 5 years. The owners of the property who are buying the places, especially in places like Florida, 5 to 6 or 7 years, and then they're selling. The politicians who are supposedly in charge of zoning and all that kind of thing, and of building a city that has a future. Well, they're concerned about their election cycles, which are 2 years or 4 years. So it's very hard to figure out who is thinking about, like, what kind of city do we want to build for 20 or 30 years down the line, and who's going to be making these difficult decisions, especially at a time like this where we have a lot of built infrastructure and we need leadership that says, you know what, this airport's going to be underwater in 10 or 15 or 20 years or even sooner. And that airport is really important to the economy of this city or this community or this region. What are we going to do to deal with that? How are we going to begin to, spend the money and relocate an airport? Or how are we going to start thinking about moving roads and doing all the things in sewer systems, stormwater drainage, all these incredibly complicated, expensive, unsexy things that need to be done in coastal communities to keep them viable and keep them alive in this rapidly changing future. And that's the heart of the problem, is that there really is nobody. It's like a game of, hot potato. It's like, no, you have the ball. No, you have the potato. And nobody's actually,
And clearly one of the ramifications you discuss around that is that while there is no long-term planning and these building the way it has will start to have an impact sooner rather than later. One of the other things that you discuss in Florida, and I'm sure it's repeated in other parts of the world, you have at the moment, though, also marginalised communities who live in very low-lying areas who can't or get insurance or can't afford insurance They have very poor utilities. So you're talking about septic tanks that fail all the time. So one of the other issues that clearly poorer communities and marginalised communities are living in some ways, very desperate situations now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm most concerned about, and one of the things that I would like people to take away from the book is this idea that there are a lot of people who are living in places that are hugely at risk. Especially, I write about a couple of communities in Florida who are 7 or 8 miles away from the coast, and they think that, and they're working class, largely Hispanic communities, kind of living the American dream kind of thing, where they've saved their entire life for these modest houses, and have no clue that these houses are hugely at risk. Because sea level rise and flooding works in unpredictable ways, as we've talked about. And in South Florida, one of the things that's going to happen is the water will come in from the west side as the Everglades floods out. And these working class communities are hugely at risk, and they have no idea. They have no notion of it. And that the value of these houses is going to decline pretty rapidly, and people are going to lose a lot, and they have no idea. And one of the things that I think is really important that I'm trying to communicate with this book is this notion of transparency of risk, of making it clear what is really coming our way, and having inspiring some conversation and discussion about that so that we're better prepared. And people can choose to live in areas where, on the coast, in high-risk areas, if that's what they want to do. I think that's great. I don't think it should be like, I'm not in any way advocating, banning coastal living or anything like that. I just think that people need to be aware of the fact of what's sort of coming, so they can make decisions for themselves, whether they want to continue to live there, whether they want to elevate their property, whether, whatever they want to do. But a lot of people really don't get it and don't know. And in these kinds of communities you're talking about is, I think, the highest risk of that. And when I was, just to add one last thing, I went to Alaska with President Obama for 3 days to talk about, on a trip that he took up there to build support for Paris. And I talked with his top climate advisor up there while we were there, and he was basically saying, we're not really concerned about like what's happening in Miami Beach, because those people have a lot of money, they'll deal with it one way or another. We're concerned about exactly the people you're talking about. What's going to happen to them? There's not going to be enough money for the government to buy them out. How is this going to play out politically?
Just thinking, even with that notion of people making those choices, one of the you touch on it specifically only briefly, but you do talk about chaos theory as it relates to climate change, and the notion of, I suppose, what we might call the knock-on effect. So we're not just talking about rising waters, we're talking about all the knock-on effects of that. And my sense would be, because you give some great examples of that, there's still, there is a level of unpredictability of what those knock-on effects can be, because some of them we don't even consider until they happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's knock-on effects of the actual physical manifestations of climate change, and exactly how fast the water will come, how high it will go, things like that, which we can talk about. But also the sort of knock-on political effects and human effects. And one of the big ones that's very pertinent to our life here in Australia is displaced people. And people who are going to be having, for example, in Indonesia and in the South Pacific Islands, there's going to be a lot of displaced people. And where are they going to go? And how will they be welcomed or not by places like Australia? As we know, displaced people and refugees is driving politics in America very powerfully right now, and around the world, and it's just going to accelerate with all of this. And I think that when you talk about knock-on effects and sort of X factors in how this will play out, it's the sort of larger displaced people politics of that and potential for conflict and things that is, to me, the most disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the questions down the line, but we'll just extend it a bit here because it's one of the issues we talked about in Sydney. And it seems obvious that the climate of fear in both Australia and the States, at the moment, it would seem that, ethically or at a level of principle, we're simply not equipped to face up to that reality on either side of the Pacific, are we?
No, not even close.
No, not even close. Can we go back? You just mentioned visiting Alaska with President Obama, which is a wonderful chapter in the book. And if I could just quote, and then I've got a couple of questions, and they are relative to the philosophical frustrations that we've talked about in Sydney and even out the back tonight. So this is quoting from Jeff's book. This is Jeff's in Alaska with Obama. At one point on the trip, if the American people see the President of the United States standing atop a melting glacier and telling them the world is in trouble, will they care? So Jeff poses it as a question. So my two questions to that are, well, do they? And do we care enough to bring about the change that's necessary? And even if we do, so the people in this room, are there, I suppose, and I don't mean this in a sort of a, well, I suppose I was going to say I don't mean in a sinister way, but are there forces that don't care enough and can stop our concerns from getting any traction?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a, determined effort for as long as climate science has been around for the last 30 years, to spread disinformation, to slow the progress of change, to raise debate, to manufacture doubt in a similar way that the fossil fuel industry has been leading this, from the time of the old days of the Greening Earth Society, where they argued that more CO2 in the atmosphere was going to be a good thing for the planet. That kind of quickly got disabused, but it's come out recently with ExxonMobil that they knew about the risks of climate change from the 70s, and there's been a very organized effort to cloud information about this, to dissuade people from taking action on it. I don't think it's entirely. It's not like I don't blame. It's not entirely that. I mean, this is also a big problem that is hard to get your mind around, and it has, it's slow motion, and the science is complex. There's a lot of reasons why we haven't taken more dramatic action than we have now. But I think that the fossil fuel industry and their denial campaign is really a big part of it.
One of the reasons that I asked this of Jeff again, part of the conversation at the Sydney Writers' Festival, I think it had just been announced that day or just before that day of the amount of carbon in the atmosphere going to, I think, 408 parts per million.
410.
Yeah, so going through that 400 barrier that we fear so much. And Jeff said, and I'm paraphrasing, so you'll get the chance to correct me, something like, there are many of us been writing about this for a long time now. Many of us have been talking about this for a long time now, and we've achieved nothing. And me sitting there doing research on climate justice, getting immediately deflated. Okay, we're doing nothing. I think, I don't want to disagree with what you're saying, but again, going back to that point of what forces are at play that stop change, one of the things that I find when I'm doing the work I'm doing, so I get to talk to a lot of community groups, I get to read what people are doing, I think, remarkably well at a local grassroots level, and I get to speak to a lot of people who are seriously concerned with the issue and seriously invested. But it seems at some level we're able to engage at a local level. We're able to sort of spread that knowledge a little further out, and we're able to get that energy sort of rippling out to a certain point. But it's difficult to get beyond that point. And it seems to get beyond that point, we have to have governments who will respond. We have to have companies that will change. We certainly, as an activist, we want to force change upon recalcitrants, but it's very difficult, it seems, at the moment, particularly in countries like Australia and the US, to budge those really recalcitrant forces who have enormous control over what happens.
Right. Just to correct one thing is, I didn't say we've done nothing. I mean, we've done a lot, right? In reporting about climate change for 15 or 20 years, I've met an enormous number of really inspired people who have done incredible things. We've done a lot with renewable energy. Price of renewable energy has gone way down. There's so many inspiring things that have happened that it's very inspiring. What's tragic though is that, and what I was talking about in Sydney, is that when you look at the only metric that really matters when you think about climate change, and that is the percentage of CO2 molecules in the atmosphere, that the graph of that is just going like this. There's no blip for Kyoto or Paris or Elon Musk. There's no Elon Musk blip or anything. It's just this, accelerating number, and that has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with population growth of the world. It has to do with, even though the U.S. is in Europe and to some degree Australia is doing things to move towards renewable energy, we're not going anywhere near fast enough. We're still burning, more coal, more oil, more gas, all of these reasons. And it just shows what an enormous task this is. And, we're not going to solve this by recycling plastic bags. It's really important to recycle plastic bags for lots of reasons, but we need the big levers. We need what happened in Paris times 20. I mean, Paris was an incredibly inspiring moment because and I was there, and it was this moment when the world kind of came together for the first time and really acknowledged that this is a problem. And it was, a lot of factors led to that. There was the terrorist attack, a month or so before in Paris, which made it a very emotional moment. You had people like Tony de Bruyn, the Prime Minister of the Marshall Islands, standing up and talking about this sort of existential crisis for his nation and other low-lying nations that really galvanized a lot of people. It was really inspiring. I remember when the gavel went down, I just turned to this woman next to me I had no idea who she was, and gave her this big hug, and she gave me this big hug, and then we looked at each other like, who are you? I don't know. But it was that kind of moment where you just hugged the person next to you, something I've never done ever in my life before. I mean, an unknown person. I do hug my children frequently. But we need that kind of thing. We need large-scale political action, and that's what's lacking.
With that in mind, I mean, one of the things that I've done since we last met, I should have mentioned, Jeff has written a series of books, and a book that you wrote 10 years ago now, I think, Big Coal. It's a book, even though it's a decade old, it's very relevant to certainly my thinking in Australia. I'm just wondering when you then can talking about the big changes that need to be made to have an impact on this rise of carbon in the atmosphere. What advice would you give Australians? And we love taking advice from Americans. We don't have an inferiority complex in this country. How do you feel about the idea that there's the potential in Australia to open up one of the biggest coal mines in the history of mining, the Adani mine in Queensland, and what does that say about our ability to change, and what does it say about those inroads that we're trying to make in relationship to carbon in the atmosphere?
So I have written, I said, about climate change and things for 20 years almost now, and thought about this from many different angles. I've written about the coal industry. I've written about climate science. I've written about lots of different things. And I have to say that this Adani coal mine, the possibility of opening this giant coal mine this is going on here is probably the sort of saddest, most tragic, sort of most depressing development. And I'm actually not prone to being very kind of, to saying things like that. But at this point, where by every measure, renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels, where we know so clearly the risks of climate change. Before the Sydney Writers Festival, I took my daughter to the Barrier Reef and we went diving for 5 days because I really wanted her to see the reef at its best, because I don't know how long it's going to be there. And that's one of these incredible, wonders of nature. And as we're coming back to Gladstone from Heron Island, we go by this giant coal transport station. And she looks at me and says, "Dad, is that coal?" And I said, "Yes." And because poor girl has grown up with me, she knows what that means. But so the notion that anyone would be considering opening that mine, a mine like that now, and especially exporting it for power for Bangladesh. I mean, it's a power plant in India that supposedly is going to get a lot of this, but to power Bangladesh, which is one of the nations most at risk, it's just insanity on every level. So, that's the kind of thing where I'm usually pretty upbeat about the possibilities, and the creativity can do a lot of things, and innovation and all that, but that's a really stupid project that really breaks my heart.
What about one of the arguments put by supporters of the mine, and again, the reason I'm asking you is because I think that clearly in this book, the extent of your global knowledge and global travel has been really helpful to my thinking. What about one of the arguments put as a supposed moral argument that how dare we as a first world nation deny the opportunity of a third world nation to have power the same way that we do?
That's the same. The thing that's sad.
Do you think that was a Dorothy Dixon?
I mean, this is the same arguments the coal industry has been making for 30 years. It's like, oh, we're going to solve poverty by burning more coal, and we're bringing power to poor people, whether it's in West Virginia or Bangladesh or wherever, or the economic argument that this is going to bring jobs and this is going to keep our economy going. I saw in the Morning Herald yesterday that there was this idea that if this mine is not open, it increases the sovereign risk. It's insane. I mean, if you want to bring power to poor people, put up solar panels. It's much cheaper. It's simpler. It's faster. I mean, it's not about that. It's just a kind of logic and rhetoric used to keep the old beast going. It's really not about economic development or about cheap energy. It's about enriching the fossil fuel guys.
Yeah, and the other thing that it certainly comes out in the book to some extent, but also in conversations with you, how do you feel about the relationship, and they are intertwined in some ways, but not always, but the relationship, say, between renewables, different renewable technologies, which can be quite simple to be effective, and sometimes Elon Musk quite grand, and geoengineering. Because one of the arguments, and it's certainly an argument put by within the environmental community, that geoengineering is another form of what you might call scientific control of nature rather than adapting to nature, or that if we put too much trust in geoengineering, we're putting too much trust in schemes that have sometimes failed in the past.
Yeah, so I think for a conversation's sake, we should explain, or I should explain what geoengineering is, so people who, in case you don't know. So geoengineering is basically this notion of sort of large-scale human manipulation of the Earth's atmosphere, which some people would say, well, obviously we are doing now by putting CO2 and lots of other stuff up into that atmosphere. And the argument for geoengineering is like, we're already screwing up the Earth's climate. Maybe we can get good at it. Maybe we can do it in ways that are less damaging. And one of the ways that is often talked about, and I think that you're talking about here, is the notion of putting small particles, sulfate particles or other materials, high in the stratosphere that would reflect away a little bit of sunlight and cool off the planet. Basically, a kind of artificial volcanoes is one way to think about it. It's technologically not really very complicated to do. It could be done with high altitude airplanes. Nobody's doing this yet, but it's out there as a possibility. I wrote about it 7 or 8 years ago, and it's become more and more central to the conversation now. And I think it's a very bad idea for obvious reasons. Once we start screwing with things like that, it can affect monsoons and all that kind of, and larger sort of atmospheric patterns and all kinds of reasons. But sad to say, I do think there's an inevitability that we're heading in that direction, because I think that as climate impacts increase more and more, and it becomes more and more clear that we're moving into this sort of new age of kind of climate chaos, there's going to be a lot of people saying we have to do something. And one of the things that we can do that's a sort of a kind of quick fix is this, or can be sold as a quick fix, is this idea of geoengineering, of putting these particles up there. And there's already, there's the notion. One of the interesting angles of this is that groups of small island states, or people, or someone who is, if Bill Gates was sympathetic to small island states, to the Marshall Islands, they could do this themselves, right? One of the tragedies of climate change is the fact that the people who have done the least to cause the problem are the ones who are suffering the most. And to some, geoengineering is a kind of revenge tool, or well, you could think about it that way. It's like, we're going to take care of this problem ourselves, and put some of these particles up in the stratosphere with some high altitude aircraft and deal with it. And it's a really terrible idea, but it's not hard to see why things are moving in that direction.
A related point to engineering, not geoengineering, but one of the another theme, or certainly places that you visit, you look at schemes to put up barriers, whether it be in Venice or the Netherlands, different schemes basically to hold the water at bay. One of the themes that seems to come out, even those who are thinking, yes, this needs to be done, is that when it's pointed out, well, hang on, that lock that you're building or that wall that you're building, that will keep the water out if it goes to 3 feet, but we may be looking at 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, is that in those conversations when it's pointed out that this may be in fact a much more substantial problem and your wall will not keep the water out, people tend to pretend they didn't hear the question.
Right. Well, this question of how do you build coastal defenses in a world where there's uncertainty about what we're going to be seeing and how fast the waters are going to be rising. The classic case of this that I write about in the book is Venice, which they just about finished with this barrier at the edge of the lagoon to keep water out of Venice. They've spent 25 years engineering this. It's a giant project, $6 billion or so to build it, maybe $5.5 billion for the actual structure, and $500 million in payoffs to buy ski condos and stuff for the contractors and government officials. 500 people went to jail for corruption in this process. Typical kind of big infrastructure project. You always have to have a little percentage for the ski condos. But the problem is they spent 25 years engineering this and $6 billion, and they didn't factor in sea level rise, and they didn't factor in any kind of adaptability to sea level rise. So they've spent all this money to build this thing that's going to be obsolete in a decade or so, and that's one of the big problems with these sort of ideas of big coastal infrastructure is like, how do you build it in flexible, adaptable ways? And there are ways of thinking about that, and some engineers, of course, are now beginning to understand this. So the people who are thinking about redoing the Thames Barrier, for example, have some really innovative ideas about how to engineer something that can be flexible and added to over time. But the real truth is that we're going to spend a lot of money doing really dumb stuff to try to protect our coastlines. You know, building seawalls in places that don't last or that cause more damage than they protect from. There's just going to be a lot of dumb engineering that's going to happen when, you know, broadly, the real kind of solution for this is a kind of living with water, thinking about living with water more than building walls to protect us from water, and also retreating. Retreat's an inevitability in this story that is going to come one way or another. Which
goes back to those contrasts that you found in Lagos, and to think of another dumb idea. You talked about the Eko Atlantic project.
Yeah.
With the question, if you could just briefly explain to the audience what that project is, because one of the aspects of that project which is worrying is that one possible solution to climate change, for all its folly, is that those who can afford to shore themselves up in the short term it will do so at the great, not only the expense of those around them, but create this incredible division. Now, we know that are already poorer communities suffering now, but a project like that, where you literally house, you know, thousands of very rich people, and over the wall, they're surrounded by millions of poor people who are drowning.
Right.
Could you just tell us what that project is and what that says about the dumb way we
well, it's an interesting kind of metaphor for the larger climate impacts and the way climate is clearly going to play out, in the sense that people who are wealthy and can afford to protect themselves will, and others sort of will be left to their own devices, basically. So what you're talking about is a project in Lagos, which is, as many of you know, is in Nigeria. It's a city of about 20 million people, income of about $2 a day, you know, 400,000 people or something living in these water slums. But it's also got a lot of money for, you know, the 1% or the 2%, largely because of the oil industry in Nigeria. And they're trying to build it into a kind of financial hub of Africa. And so a developer came up with this idea, Eko Atlantic, which is basically building a kind of artificial island that's roughly attached to the city of Lagos, that is a kind of fortress in the water. It's about 6 kilometers long and about 2 kilometers wide. It's built 25 feet above the sea. It's got this big barrier of kind of seawalls and riprap all around it. They're building these condos. They want to try to turn it into the sort of Dubai of Africa. So they're building all these condos with all these fancy, you know, amenities to it, you know, broad streets with beautiful trees, and it's this sort of fortress paradise in the middle of this teeming slum. And they're selling it explicitly as a refuge, as a protected fortress from, you know, the people around and from the raging seas and the climate. And, you know, they do a really good job they hype the climate issues far more than I do, because they are using it as a way of selling, like, you'll be safe here, you know. But of course, my immediate thought going up there and being in these buildings, which are still in the process of being built, and there's only a few that are being inhabited yet, but they project that there will be like 300,000 people living in this area, is that how safe are you going to feel when you're in this fortress and you have 19.5 million people all around you who are not feeling safe? How safe are you going to be in you know, behind your walls there? And that's broadly where a lot of things are going. Is that and sea walls and these kinds of fortresses are the great metaphor for that. We had that in New York City even. We're talking about post-Sandy, after the Hurricane Sandy, there have been a number of projects in New York, and one of the big projects is this idea of building a wall around Lower Manhattan. It's called the Big U. That they hate it when I call it a wall. They like to call it a barrier with amenities. So it will be a barrier, 25-foot or 20-foot high barrier with cappuccino, I guess, around Lower Manhattan. But it also brings up the question of like, okay, well, you who live in Brooklyn and Red Hook and the Bronx, there's not going to be any big U or barrier with amenities for you. And, the wall ends at 40th Street, and the people on 44th Street are not happy about that. And, so the whole idea of coastal defenses, and especially walls, brings up these social justice issues that are very profound.
Okay. I'm going to ask Jeff one last question, and then we're going to invite questions from the audience. So start to think about your questions, which will be very short and to the point, so that we can get as many questions in as possible. So just while you're gathering your thoughts, at the end of the book, or near the end of the book, you visit a site outside Copenhagen, which was the site of a meteor strike. And you're really, in a way, it's talking about the sort of death throes of the dinosaur. Are we prone to go the way of the dinosaur if we don't get this in order, or is our thinking sometimes so ignorant that that is more than just a metaphor? I'm not a catastrophist. I mean, I think this is going to be a profound. I thought you were in the book.
No, I mean, I think human beings are like cockroaches. I don't think that we're going to be killed off. And sea level rise is certainly not about any kind of mass extinction event or anything like that. It's going to have profound economic impacts. It's going to have profoundly change how we think about how we live. But it's not a civilization-ending event. And I don't even think that climate change is a civilization-ending event. I think it's a event that's going to bring a lot of pain and loss and suffering to a lot of people, but it's also going to bring a lot of creativity, a lot of inspired thinking. I mean, it's not like, even when it comes to coastal cities, it's not like, we've figured it all out and our cities are perfect and we haven't built a lot of dumb stuff. I mean, we've built a lot of dumb stuff. And one way to think about this is, urban renewal by Mother Nature, And so we'll have a chance to rethink a lot of things. And I've spent a lot of time with a lot of really interesting architects and urban planners who have really kind of cool, brilliant ideas about how we're going to live with water and how we're going to live in an adaptable way and how we're going to take ideas from these indigenous cultures and translate them into the modern world. So to me, it was the layer of ash outside of in Denmark that was from the meteor that killed off the dinosaurs. But if the dinosaurs hadn't been killed off, we wouldn't be here, right? It was the killing off of the dinosaurs that led to the birth of, the reign of the mammals and eventually to us. And I think that, change is good in a way. And I think that what's important here is thinking about it, managing that change, being proactive about it so that we minimize the sort of suffering and destruction that will come our way and maximize the creativity and innovation that can help us deal with it.
I feel better than I did in Sydney. Questions. We've got roving mics, so if you put your hand up, our microphone people will find you. So we were told not to do that, Jeff, so
yeah.
Who wants to ask the first question, please? Yeah, there's a hand up. So where are the mic people? Oh, okay, and okay.
I'm just wondering, you talk about the reluctance of people to address the issue. I'm just wondering whether the reason a lot of our politicians don't want to get involved is that they're aware of the magnitude of the problem and they don't want to actually inspire any fear in the general public. And I'm just wondering if you could talk to that, because from my reading and the things that I've heard, the American defence industry are already factoring a 2-metre sea level rise in their plans. And with the amount of thermal mass that we've got and the likelihood of further melt, that we keep talking about the 2100 scenario, but we're not talking about the 22 or 2300 scenario. I'm talking 200 to 300 years' time when the sea level rise will be even more than 1 to 2 metres. So it's the fear, and I'm wondering whether there's too much fear about creating panic.
Well, I mean, I think that's certainly true. I mean, I think that, first of all, it's a very small percentage of politicians who actually know enough about this and have thought enough about this to even think that way. President Obama talked about that with me. He certainly understood the magnitude of what is coming, and he felt a very strong responsibility to inspire hope in people and to not make them fearful and not to paralyze people with fear. And I think that's a real thing, and I think that that's really important. But I don't think that that's the central problem for political leaders. I think the central problem for political leaders is that they either are captured by special interests, namely the fossil fuel industry, about this, or they simply don't see the political benefit of talking about it in any meaningful way, of asking people to do hard things. I mean, this is going to require people to change, and it's going to require money. It's going to require, it's not really sexy to run for, in the U.S. for congressman or for mayor on, like, we need to spend, $100 million on a new sewage drainage system. That's not something that's going to get you into office. And it's also really difficult to talk about all this kind of stuff the way our media works, right? We've really seen this in America with the Trump administration, where every day it's not like one crazy news story, it's like 17 crazy news stories. And the idea of in an administration like the Trump administration trying to have any kind of conversation, even if he wasn't a climate denier and think it was a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese, having any kind of conversation about long-term things like this that are hard is very, very, very difficult. So there's a lot of things that are conspiring against a sort of conversation, a real conversation about this. And just the last thing, because I don't know what other questions, but I think what's going to make politicians and others drive this conversation and things happen is economics. As insurance prices rise in the U.S., coastal cities' credit ratings are starting to get hit by risks. I just spoke at an insurance company conference. Bank mortgages, how do you write mortgages, 30-year mortgages, when the house might not be there in 30 years or might be worth half as much in 30 years? There's a lot of financial implications to all this that are going to be happening in real time that are beginning to inspire action, I think.
Yes, you touched on the subject of Adani just a few moments ago. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the Northern Territory in Australia, about a month ago, the government there announced that they would open the state up to the area up to fracking. I was at a talk about 2 weeks ago by a group called BZE, Beyond Zero Emissions, and the speaker there, a climate scientist, had charts which indicated that, notwithstanding the potential emissions from Adani, the fracking potential emissions from Northern Territory will be about 4 times as large, and that's not commonly known yet. But are there any comments you'd like to make on fracking and its role in the picture you're talking about?
Yeah, fracking is, something I have a lot of experience with in the U.S., and I know, for a while natural gas was sold as, the sort of bridge to the future, right? That was the idea with natural gas. And one of the reasons that we've had such a decline in coal consumption in the U.S., it's gone from about 50% of our electricity to about 30%, is because of natural gas being cheaper and putting coal plants out of business. And so there's been an argument that that's sort of a good thing, but it's clear that this sort of bridge to the future idea is really not, or if it's a future, it's a long way off. And one of the things that's coming clear with fracking too is the fugitive methane emissions. The methane that's leaking out everywhere is a huge problem and has not really been detected. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 is. So I totally agree that fracking is its own kind of nightmare, and it's not really a bridge to the future. And I go back to what I said before, that especially in a country like Australia, where you have so much sunshine and you have the renewables, wind and solar, but especially for a place like this, solar is getting just so cheap now that it's even hard to make the argument that there's any place for natural gas either. And when you're thinking about how are we going to repower our world, it's all about solar and wind right now.
Can I just add something relative to the question? If you're concerned about fracking in Australia, I'd urge people to go on your computer and look up SEED, the Indigenous Youth Climate Change Coalition, because they are one of the leading groups in Australia who are campaigning against fracking, not only as it applies to Aboriginal land and the territory, as the gentleman just mentioned, but this technology generally. So doing a lot of work on the ground on our behalf. So it would be, I think, invaluable for you to look at what they're doing. What we're going to do is take one more question for Jeff. There is someone down the front here. One more question for Jeff, and then we're going to make some closing comments.
Hi. You talked about being proactive, but you also talked about being for the need to educate people about the risks in involving living near coasts and things like that. But I was wondering why you think it's up to individuals to judge whether it's safe for them to live near coasts or not, and not up to governments and other organisations to say whether or not people can live in an area that's unsafe or that's going to be taken over by sea level rise in the future?
Well, I mean, I think that it's certainly up to governments to decide. Like in the U.S., we're still building in a lot of areas that are highly at risk and are low-lying, and I think it's one of the jobs of government is to zone differently so that certain areas that are obviously high risk, we're not continuing to build it in. So there is certainly, I don't mean to say that there's sort of no government responsibility, but I think that, if someone wants to build a house on a coast that, that coast is going to be inundated and it's essentially a high risk place. I mean, I'm not sure what the role of government is to say, no, you're not allowed to live there. No, you're not allowed to be there. I think that, especially for existing stuff, I think it's a complicated back and forth, but we need more informed decision-making on the government side with zoning and building codes, and we need more informed thinking on the kind of consumer side, so that people are more aware of not just the risks of where they live, but also of what government is or isn't doing. One of the best things Obama said to me during my trip, and I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but it was kind of an important moment in the political equation of all this, is we were talking about some of this stuff about changing how we live on coastlines and more dramatic action on climate in general. And he said, make me do it. He really believed that, he needed more communities, more people forcing him and other politicians to do this and pushing them rather than depending upon them to show leadership. That the only way that he could really do the kinds of things he wanted to do was if there was sort of local and community support that built up and pushed this. And I think that's really true broadly about this.
Okay. Just in closing, clearly there's a lot, not only in Jeff's book, but in this broader discussion tonight for us to take forward. And apologies to, I'm sure, many people who have questions, but we only have our allotted time. We can't pay overtime rates here, I don't think. If you talk to Jeff down the back, I'm sure that there are other questions that he can take up. But What I would say in closing is that my day job is in researching on climate justice and climate change, and I've been reading a lot of material over the last 3 years about the issue and writing and publishing around the issue. And I think for me, while Jeff's book was informative in the sense of what's happening in different parts of the globe, I think more importantly for me, it is a book that raised a lot of questions for me, and questions that simply can't be easily resolved, but questions that we have to think about, concern ourselves with, and importantly, discuss with other people as we've done here tonight. I really want to thank you, Jeff, for being here, because if we are going to make the sort of changes that we need to make, we need to have so many more of these conversations, and we need to be able to act on those conversations. So please put your hands together and thank Jeff for his contribution.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.